Today, I am joined by Colonel Douglas MacGregor. He is a decorated veteran, the author of 5 groundbreaking books on military transformation. He holds a PhD in international relations, and he is a highly respected expert on defense and foreign policy. He was also the senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense in the Trump administration. So, Colonel MacGregor, thank you so much for joining me.
Sure.
Well, you have been remarkably accurate with your analysis and predictions, especially covering Ukraine. And you have said that the war will likely end with Russia controlling all of eastern Ukraine, if not all of Ukraine. And we're starting to see a more accurate picture emerge in the media about what's really happening. So can you kind of summarize what you believe will happen next in Ukraine and why it's important to ordinary Americans?
Yeah, well, I think it is very important to Americans to know the truth. And the truth has been very unpopular for quite a while. Don't want to cover too much history, but this war has been brewing for well over a decade. Some people would argue for at least 20, 25 years because of the unwillingness in the West to look at the reality that the way the map is drawn of Ukraine, it is inaccurate, frankly. There are Ukrainians, true Ukrainians, but they did not live in Crimea. It's never been part of Ukraine. And most of the area that we call the Donbass, the Donetsk Basin, is really Russian, and the people that live there are Russian. And the easy way is to go back and look at the electoral maps showing how people voted over the last, previous elections. You see that the East is overwhelmingly voting in favor of the pro-Russian candidate, and the West, which is on the other side of the Dnieper River, is usually voting overwhelmingly for the anti-Russian candidate, whoever that happens to be. So there was always a need to address this. And I had argued for a plebiscite. Other people argued for it. I also always felt very strongly that it was in Ukraine's interest to be a neutral state, that it could be much like Austria, and like Austria, could profit enormously from its neutrality. And this, of course, was sabotaged by first the Bush administration, then subsequently Obama. And I think that Trump was subverted by his own Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense and his entire national security team, who all wanted to press ahead with this expansion of NATO and incorporate Ukraine. So I think President Trump was left sort of standing there without anybody supporting him, and then found himself out of office. And it wasn't long thereafter that Putin gave up, because he said, there's no one I can talk to. There's no one who will negotiate with me. I'm left no choice. Because what we did after 2014 was build this enormous Ukrainian military power that was designed to attack Russia, frankly, from eastern Ukraine. Ukrainians said they wanted to get back Crimea. We said, fine. And they wanted to punish the Russians living in Luhansk, and Donetsk for being Russians and not converting to become 100% Ukrainian, speaking Ukrainian, so forth, so on. So bottom line is you get this war. And from the very beginning, I think Putin made some miscalculations. He thought that if he demonstrated how serious he was and his country was about the growing threat to Russia in eastern Ukraine, that we would pay attention to him. Well, we did, but we decided to double down on the threat that we were creating. And his great fear was that in addition to this Ukrainian army, that of course theater ballistic missiles would show up that would put his entire nuclear deterrent as well as all of his major cities at risk. So he marched in, and initially it was a very cautious approach designed to do as little damage as possible, kill as few people as possible. And it took really almost until the summer to figure out there's nobody out there. Nobody's going to talk to us. Nobody's going to negotiate. We're stuck. We're going to have to change our entire approach. And so we go into this long haul approach, which is basically a 30-month plan for a 30-month war. And that's what he adopted in the summer. We've had this massive Russian military buildup to the point now where we have what Biden and his supporters said he didn't want, which is this large and powerful Russian military power sitting on NATO's eastern border. In other words, he went in theoretically to protect NATO, and he got the opposite. And NATO is rapidly falling apart. And we see from these leaked documents that have come out the tremendous disunity inside the NATO alliance. And for your purposes, I'm sure your listeners know that one of the fatal mistakes that we made was to assume that Russia was this economically weak, backward power. I think someone put it, was it McCain, who said, Russia's a gas station with nuclear weapons.
That's right.
They discovered they could not be more wrong. So Russia has an abundance of resources and energy, of course, which makes it the perfect partner for China that needs all of that to continue to sustain its economic expansion. And we've ended up on the wrong side in the sense that we're suffering economically. Our European allies are suffering very, very acutely from this war and from all these self-defeating sanctions.
Well, I was actually going to go there next. In Ukraine, we seem to have made financial sanctions the centerpiece of our military strategy, weaponizing the dollar. And economic sanctions were a useful weapon, decades ago, but the world has evolved to really neutralize them. So what implications do Western financial sanctions failing so visibly have in the geopolitical sphere here?
Well, keep in mind that for many, many decades, we've used our command of the World Bank and other financial centers because effectively the dollar dominates everything. We not only pass on our debt to others by compelling everybody else to use the dollar, but the institutions, global institutions, use the dollar because it's convenient. And what we've done is we've effectively bullied so many people for so long that many are now saying, well, Russia's got a point, China's got a point. Why should we do business constantly in the dollar? Now, this doesn't mean that the so-called reserve currency is going to go away instantly, but I think it's in serious trouble. So this DeDollarization is very serious at this point. We shouldn't underestimate it. But I think we brought it on ourselves. If you constantly beat people over the head with, as you say, this weapon, this financial weapon, eventually they come back and say, we've had it. I mean, people living in Honduras or Costa Rica or Southeast Asia and Thailand are being told, if you want our assistance, our support, then grow these crops. Imagine that, being told what crops you will grow and so forth. It's gotten really out of hand. The sanctions are just another manifestation of this. And frankly, all the sanctions that we've imposed on Russia have turned out to be undercut anyway. So the oil and the gas, along with rare earths and every other conceivable mineral and foodstuffs, all those things are seeping out one way or the other. It's kind of, if you pass a law in the United States, and it's a fundamentally flawed law, whatever it happens to be, it's a law that everyone opposes, and people really don't want to obey it, ultimately what happens? It's meaningless, because over time the police decide not to enforce it because they can't. Well, that's largely what's happened to us and our financial dominance on the planet.
Well, something I've talked about many times on this show is that every fiat currency has failed. Some lasted months, some a century, but all have failed. And we depegged from gold in the 1970s. We continue to print these paper promises. We spend more than we take in. We're net consumers, whereas all these countries that we have tensions with are net producers. So where does the dollar go from here? You said it won't be the reserve. It won't lose that status very quickly. But, did these sanctions accelerate losing that status?
Yes. I think they contribute enormously to it. I really wish that I could drag my son into this discussion. He's a brilliant financial analyst, and he's someone I pay attention to, and I've listened to him for years, which is why I'm heavily invested in digital currency, because he's pointed out that we're really on a path to one of two destinations right now. One destination, of course, is, well, the Fed will just print money. And that's the widespread assumption. They'll continue to print and print and print. What's to stop us? Well, there are a lot of things that can stop you from printing more money, not the least of which is something called hyperinflation. We've been down that road before. We could turn to the Weimar Republic in the interwar period. There talk about Argentina. We go any number of different places and find it. So that's one destination. The other destination is that at some point, no one's buying your treasuries. And when nobody's buying your treasuries and you can no longer buy them all up, and even worse, other countries begin to dump your treasuries, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, you have to restructure your debt. It's called defaulting. Now, people say, oh, we've never defaulted. Well, that's a lot of nonsense. In 32 and 34, we did. We called it restructuring our debt. Now, restructuring the debt is very painful, as you know. And as my son points out to me all the time, credit's going to dry up. And you're going to have to live without credit for some period of time. I mean, it's going to be hell on earth for people that are accustomed to essentially relentless financial expansion. But the other problem we face that no one ever discusses is this financialization of our economy.
That's right.
What do we build? What do we produce? Well, we produce a lot of military equipment and technology, but there's a problem with that. There's not much return on investment, which is why anybody with any sense, like President Eisenhower, was always trying to keep defense expenditures to what he considered to be the acceptable minimum. In other words, you want to maintain the security of your country. He wasn't interested in being the policeman of the world, obviously. And he didn't like all of these alliances, but he set them up in a way that made them unambiguously defensive. And when, for instance, Austria wanted to become neutral, he welcomed it. In fact, Eisenhower said we should try to neutralize more countries in Europe because we simply can't defend them all. Well, his wise words and wise counsel have been largely abandoned. So now, then here's the last problem. In addition to having sort of built the empire that we can't afford, much like the British did, and then run ourselves into bankruptcy, where do you put your store of wealth? How do you preserve it? And I think digital currency is one of those options. And in fact, it may be, I shouldn't make these kinds of predictions, but of course, John Kenneth Galbraith, who once said that economic forecasting exists to make astrologers look professional. So I feel like I can make an economic forecast since I think Galbraith was right. I have a feeling that digital currency over time may well replace most of the fiat currency.
Do you think that Bitcoin could serve as a global reserve currency?
I don't know. I mean, I'm in over my head, and everyone out there will say, well, you didn't go to the Wharton School. That's true. Now, my grandfather went to the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Both of my grandfathers went to Penn, but it doesn't help me. I didn't. I'm not a business school graduate, although I have lots of people telling me not to worry about it. But that's never, that's another issue. But the bottom line is, I don't know, but I think digital currency that cannot be controlled and manipulated through a central banking system is something that's very, very appealing to people. Now, beyond that, I don't know. I wish I could make more profound predictions for you, but I can't. But I think that's real. I mean, isn't everyone sick of the banking system's manipulation of wealth and power? For how many years have we gone through this? And then somebody says, well, when the Fed was established in the United States, in the intervening years, we're down to 10%, the dollar's at 10% of what it was worth in 1911? It's incomprehensible. So I think there's a desire for something else. There's no question about it. And I think digital currency has a bright future. Beyond that, I can't say too much.
Right. I definitely agree that we need a parallel system. I think a lot of the policymakers use Bitcoin as an invisibility cloak. They make it look like the threat when actually they don't want to admit that their own policies are what got us here. And if we lose the dollar's reserve status, we won't be able to sustain these trillion-dollar deficits, part of which go to fund the military, right? So things will need to change. The military budget will have to come down to something reasonable for the size of our economy. I know that right now from sources within the military, they're still basing budgets on 2% CPI and not accounting for the increase in inflation. Entitlements will be affected. So how do you see this really playing out?
Well, there are three things that your viewers need to understand. First of all, money into defense does not necessarily produce capability on the other end. Just spending money doesn't equal capability. We spend far too much for what we get in most cases. In some cases, we spend a great deal and we do get a good return on investment. I think that's particularly true in surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance, platforms, and capabilities, but many other areas we simply don't. So that's the first problem. Second problem is that your current military establishment remains tragically a brilliant tribute to the Second World War. We're still building surface fleets around aircraft carrier battle groups. We're still fielding large, ponderous Army divisions that are too heavy to move, too heavy to lift. But even worse, the world doesn't fight that way anymore. And that's one of the things that we have to pay attention to what's been happening in Ukraine, because it fundamentally changes the way you look at things. That's a huge problem. And then you've got the threat inflation industry. You want to keep this monstrous military establishment running, and you keep insisting it's vitally necessary, because if anything isn't spent for 10 cents less or 10 billion less, you're at risk of being conquered. and overrun and destroyed. By whom? Well, we go back to Russia. Russia presents no substantial threat to us unless, of course, we decide to attack Russia. They have an enormous nuclear arsenal. We have an enormous nuclear arsenal. We can kill each other and most of the people on the planet several times over. We don't want to use nuclear weapons. I see no evidence that Mr. Putin does. That's kind of a dumb way to look at it. Secondly, we continue to see Russia through the Cold War lens. Everyone keeps acting as though it's the Soviet Union. It's not. Russia's a very different country today. China, people can go, the Communist Party of China is doing this and this, and the Communist Party of China. The Communist Party of China is a joke. The Communist Party of China is just an elite organization, a cabal of people across the country that run the government and try to control 1.4 billion people, which is pretty damn difficult to do. They're not communists. I haven't seen very many communists in Northeast Asia whenever I've been over there to visit. The Chinese are money-grubbing people, let's face it. They are absolutely committed to profit at all costs. So I don't see much evidence for communism. I see a lot of evidence for capitalism. But I don't see evidence for Chinese armies massing on anybody's border to invade anybody. And when they look at their naval power, remember, a third of all the ships that they have floating around in the South China Sea are Coast Guard vessels. So, all right, what are we really dealing with? Are we really genuinely facing existential threats from China and Russia? And I think the president last night said it very well. He said, no. He said, our problems are here at home. And they are. So you have this group of people in Washington who seem to be ready to do anything to sustain these massive outlays in spending, not just defense, but also in entitlements, as you know. And we continue to pretend as though the Social Security system, Medicare, Medicaid, pension plans, all these things are solid. They're not. We know they're not. We pretend that the banks are solvent and not illiquid. They're not. I mean, remember back, I think it was December or November last year, all of these, stress tests were run on banks. There was like, oh, well, we're in pretty good shape. That wasn't true. Right. We are continuing to mislead ourselves in order to sustain this tremendous spending. Well, when does it stop? Well, I think, Ben Stein who said things go on until they can't? Mm-hmm. When did the British leave India? When their debt to GDP ratio was 240%? In other words, I'm afraid that the so-called ruling elites in Washington, D.C. are just going to drive us into the ground. And I hope that before then, if I have to choose between hyperinflation and default in terms of restructuring the debt, I'd rather go with the restructuring as opposed to hyperinflation. But they're all going to be painful. And no one wants to tell the American people the truth. Just as these documents have come out and told us we're losing in Ukraine, the Ukrainians are not going to win, Ukraine is being destroyed. We have the same problem at home. Our financial system is being destroyed by us.
Colonel MacGregor, thank you so, so much. You're a voice of reason during times where more common sense and reason is really needed. So thank you so much for all your time.
Well, thank you for having me.